Good morning. It's great to be back here at the Sir Roger Gifford studio on yet another glorious sunny day at Glasgow at COP26. I'm Rhian-Mari and I'm the Chief Executive of the Green Finance Institute, and here to continue today's conversation about decarbonising cities, built environment and, importantly, transport. And so here to have that conversation with me over the next 40 minutes on how are we going to unlock the capital to finance our green mobility ambitions is a fantastic panel. Joining me here in the studio, I have Uday Kemker, who's the Senior Climate Advisor to the Institutional Investor Roundtable and Vice Chairman of Sunna Mobility. I'm sure you wear some other hats as well, Uday. I've got Fiona Howarth here, the Chief Executive of Octopus Electric Vehicles, and also Chris Pateman-Jones, the CEO of Connected Curb. And joining us via video is Hiro Mizuno, who almost needs no introduction, as the UN Special Envoy on Innovative Finance and Sustainable Investments. And importantly for today's conversation, Hiro is also a non-executive director at Tesla. So we've only got 40 minutes. We've got a lot to unpack. I think I'm going to start with you, Fiona. And I guess this is the important question that we all get asked all the time, which is currently the sticker price for electric vehicles more expensive than diesel or combustion engine counterparts. So when is transitioning to electric vehicles going to be affordable for everybody? And what's the role of the private sector, do you think, in driving down that cost for the consumer?
Great questions. So I think there's two sides of this. One is actually versus the petrol or diesel counterpart, running that electric car is cheaper over its lifetime. And so it's already a no-brainer versus the alternative. So there's low running costs. You can save up to 90% on your fuel by switching from petrol and diesel to green electricity. Also, there's many fewer moving parts. It's something like 20 moving parts compared to like 2,000 in a petrol diesel car. So a lot less goes wrong. So servicing and maintenance costs are a lot lower too. So that in itself is great. There's also a number of other incentives, grants across a number of different countries, actually grants. We have a very low company car tax rate, which makes it super exciting. And we can run something called salary sacrifice for individuals, employees of different businesses. So again, even before the fuel saving and servicing and maintenance costs, it makes it cheaper than its equivalent. There is a second part, though, which is around the vehicles that are available today. So actually, historically, they've been very expensive vehicles. So, Tesla actually started out with this beautiful Model S and then the Model X, which were amazing cars, but very premium. We've seen them come out with the Model 3 and the Model Y, of course, and we're seeing more and more now affordable vehicles hit the market. So we've now got 35 different models available, and actually even at the lower end of the market we've got great comparables, particularly like things like the Volkswagen e-up, for example, and actually it's already shifted, and the kind of market and perception is just catching up with that.
Your point about the lower cost of ownership is a really important one, because
super important.
Perhaps that isn't as well recognised as it should be. Is there something more that we could all be doing to help educate, help raise awareness?
I think it's a great question. We absolutely need to be spreading that word more generally, and also the people that are talking about cars. So where do you go at the minute to think about a new car? You're likely to be walking into a dealership, for example. So how are the dealership talking about the equivalent cost of a electric vehicle versus the petrol or diesel? Have they been given the tools and the kind of words and way of articulating it? So I think there's a lot of work to be done educating the industry so that then we can be talking more broadly to the community.
One of the things that I wanted to explore on this panel was really the role of the public and the private sector working together on this. We obviously need to channel a lot of capital into the electrification of vehicle. I know you're going to have views on that, Fiona, but perhaps I could turn to Uday to ask about, how do you see this role of private capital, public capital, and actually helping mobilise more money into the electrification of road transport?
So, of course, the amount of money that it will take to completely retool a transportation system that's been set up over 150 years will be enormous. Luckily, there are tremendous savings pools that have been built over the last 30 years that are institutional ownership pools. And those pools today get low yield, which means they very often can't meet if you're a pension fund, their pension liabilities. As a result of which, they're really willing to work very hard to find new sectors and new opportunities in a world which is retooling itself. To put this together, however, and rebuild a system that's been built over 150 years in 5 to 10 years requires a greater degree of collaboration than we've ever seen before. And the role of government, very often people say, well, government's there to provide incentives. It can do a lot more than that. Because what we really need to do is to bring together an entire ecosystem. And that ecosystem starts off with the financial model of the government. For example, mobility is a service today, wherein assets are owned by financial institutions and provided to the operators of the cities, on an operating cost basis. Will, I think, really take off, because it means that people don't have to put up big capex. But to do that, you need to get your credit quality right, your contract structure right. Separately, you need to engage with OEMs and operators. You need to engage with people who do the maintenance of these vehicles and make sure the contracts for that are all well set up. You need to engage, of course, on the subject of infrastructure, which I'm sure everyone in all these sessions talks about. And all of that needs to be done collaboratively. And if there's any message I want to give, it's the role of government working together with the private sector in creating multi-stakeholder collaborative processes, which we can do. We're in Scotland right now. Scotland is a very interesting case study of how that was done in the bus sector, for example, where they brought together all these different elements to create a very successful first stage of their bus electrification. And finally, I'd say collaboration can take place not only with the leadership of government, with OEMs and operators and so forth, but also with institutional investors. And if they're involved from the beginning in the co-design of the system, then it's likely to accelerate much faster than it would do if left to its own devices.
Thank you. And there's a lot there to unpack, and I'm sure we'll come back to that, including some of the work that you've been leading personally, Uday, on these multi-stakeholder collaborations. But I wanted to bring in, before we get onto the point of infrastructure, which is absolutely key, and Chris is going to speak about that, I wanted to give a similar question to Hero, actually, about how do we get long-term investors to engage with the innovative finance mechanisms that it's going to take in order for us to decarbonise transport, as well as the built environment? Hold on one moment, Hero. We seem to be having a problem with your audio.
Thank you very much. Hi, thank you very much for having me today. Can you hear me now?
We can, perfectly, loud and clear. Thank you.
Great. So I really regret I left Glasgow over the weekend. So I left Glasgow without a memory of the beautiful sunny city. So I really, feel jealous seeing this. The sunshine is coming into your faces on a screen. I'm a UN Special Envoy to promote the innovative finance and the sustainable investments. And before I took this role, I was the former investment chief of the Japanese government pension investment fund, which managed $1.5 trillion. And then I always trying to think like how we can, like long-term investors, can support the acceleration of the society or the businesses into a more sustainable future for for the society. And we believe that that kind of like a role played by long-term investor will be a key to really accelerate the transition. Answering your question, in our business, I think innovation is kind of used in two different ways. One is financing or investing in innovation. And the second is creating innovative financial product or financial scheme to provide a capital to any business or any project. So the first one, investing or financing in innovation, I think now we started seeing like the capital market is saying it's very clear in the area of car industry and the transportation. Capital market, is now sending a very clear signal. They wanted to invest into the electrified, the vehicle and transportation. And I think every day we see it's very obvious by looking at how the market evaluate the different car makers. I just don't want to, call it legacy automakers, because the automakers, they have their own strategies. But I think many of them is now struggling with the either like a business school definition on cannibalization between their electric vehicle and ICE cars, and as Fiona mentioned, like it's becoming obvious that the cost of ownership will be better with EV, but it's very difficult for the legacy automakers to just say it in public because it's really cannibalizes their other part of business, and actually the other part of business is provide more cash flows to them. So and the other is what's called innovation dilemma, right? So I think the company has two ways to go. Hybrid, hydrogen, electric vehicle, and those kind of things is they quite easily get into innovation dilemma. So they face those situations, and the capital market already started showing what they believe in. So that's one thing, how the long-term capital really, accelerate the change of transformation. And the other innovation is the innovation in a financial product or financial scheme. You touched upon the importance of the role of public. Usually, I'm a believer of the free market. So usually, free market over the long term really come up with the ideal solution. But the problem with the climate change is it doesn't allow the market to solve that. So we just need to have public sector or policymakers intervention to set a rule so that the market can can reach the equilibrium much quicker than you usually take. And the one way to facilitate that is a new financial tool like a green bond or ESG bonds and those kind of products. And that will become the mainstream in financing, particularly like municipalities when they need to raise the money to invest in the infrastructure to enable the electric vehicle to become the major transportation tool for the general public. And then even the company can use that kind of like a new financial tools to raise money. And we started seeing a lot of signs that market prefers it, and the market sometimes accepts what's now called a sort of a green premium, accepting lower yield by investing into those products. So I think the innovation is the key, and there are different ways to put some innovation in the financial market. And I think the long-term investor should play a much more role. And during the Glasgow, the first week, for me, one of the most important days was obviously the Finance Day on the Wednesday. And the big announcement made about the G funds, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So many financial leaders are committed to net zero, and they are committed to transit their portfolio to be aligned with the 1.5 degree scenarios. And the other one is the IFRS. They announced the launch of ISSB, International Sustainability Standard Board. And now we are getting more and more information so that the investor can actually even don't have a genuine ambition to promote the sustainability. They actually now have the tool to just purely financially analyze and engineer their investment or financing portfolio to promote change.
Thank you, Hiro. I fully agree with you. This really has been the finance COP, and some announcements, especially during the first week, as you mentioned, the 450 organizations, mainstream financial organizations, now signed up to net zero, and that attempts at harmonizing standards, which has been held up by the mainstream financial community as being a barrier to doing more in this space. I also agree with the point that the markets, if we had all the time in the world, would solve for climate change, but the climate scientists sadly tell us that's not the case, which is why we certainly believe at the Green Finance Institute there's a strong case for public sector and regulatory intervention. But before we go on, the point that you're making about the innovator's dilemma, clearly you are on the board of one of the most innovative companies in the world, And my partner won't forgive me if I don't mention how much he loves his new Tesla. So, Will, I mentioned it. But the question is, you know, is the rest of the industry innovating fast enough to meet the net zero goals? And what more can we be doing there?
Well, I think at Tesla, actually, two big innovation is actually taking place, or more disruption taking place. One is replacing internal combustion engine with the electric motors and replacing fuel tank with the battery. And there's like a sort of smartphoneization of the cars. And the second one is probably doesn't affect the net zero transition. But the first one, I really don't think legacy automaker doesn't already have ability to build the electric vehicle. And the second part may differentiate Tesla from others, but as far as the manufacturing electric vehicle of BEV, I think they have enough technologies, or they can buy technologies. And what's really at the moment, becoming a bottleneck is the semiconductor shortage and the battery shortage. But it's not really an innovation. We just need to have a supply chain, bandwidth to prepare all car industry to shift into the electric vehicle. So this lack of the battery supply or the semiconductor supply actually enhances that innovators' dilemma, as well as the cannibalization problem. So I really think we need to just pay attention to whole supply chain to prepare or set up the auto industry as a whole to make a more immediate shift. But in terms of technology, I think the many of the car company, even if they may have to outsource because the Tesla more internally integrate the supply chain, but they should be able to build the cars, and it's just a matter of their will and their capability of sourcing all those necessary parts.
Thank you. So you allude to the fact this is a whole systems transformation, and obviously key to that, the supply chain, but also the underlying infrastructure, as Uday mentioned earlier. So bringing you in, Chris, how can we ensure, just in the UK, that we have a UK-wide rollout of charging infrastructure? And I guess the real question is, whose responsibility do you think it is to finance that rollout so that it is across the whole country?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me here as well. Just before I start, though, I think it's also relevant to say I think the supply chain is really important when you talk about the charging infrastructure as well. The scale of deployment that's required, actually supply chain becomes really important, and we've started to already look at that as a business. I think also just to the point of vehicles, before I touch on the infrastructure, the cost of vehicles, the part that often is forgotten because we talk about the individual buying cars, is it's going to be fleet that's going to drive this transition in a large degree. And fleet cares less about the purchase price of the vehicle and more about the resale value of the vehicle, or equally about the resale value of the vehicle. And EVs hold up very well. So I think some of the transition there is going to be driven by fleet as well as the individual. And I think that can maybe move quite quickly, providing the infrastructure is there. In terms of driving an EV transition across the whole of society, I think I think there are a number of solutions out there, but maybe I'll start with what happens if we don't get this right. So at the moment, EV is largely dominated by those who have the money to be able to buy some quite expensive vehicles at the moment, although there are fantastic leasing options out there. You don't have to buy the vehicle. But those are often, and I don't have the statistic to hand, but well over 90% of those people are people who have driveways. If you have a driveway today, you can make an EV work for you, because the purchase price is important, or the leasing price is important, but it's actually about convenience and reliability. So that is what drives people's decisions. So the people who have EVs today are people who are ideological buyers. They're people who are buying for sustainability reasons. They're not necessarily the rest of society. The rest of society is often buying for logic-based reasons. Admittedly, the rest of society is getting involved and understanding sustainability now, and that is a driver. But people buy based on, is this going to be convenient for my life? And unfortunately, a lot of the charging infrastructure to date hasn't necessarily been the case. Again, if you have a driveway, put a charging point on your drive, you'll use that for 95+% of the times when you're charging. So the public charging infrastructure needs to be enhanced. A lot of the investment's been into rapid charging to date, which is great, but I think we forget when we talk about rapids that often we're talking about a technology speed rather than a user experience speed. So the reason people charge on their driveway at home is because the charger may take 9 hours, but actually it takes 30 seconds in their mind because they plug in, they press go, and then they're doing something completely different. So user experience is very different to charging technology speed. So we think there's a blend that's required. It's going to be ultra rapids as well as slow fast. And then rapids in the middle, but you're going to see a polarization of charging infrastructure where you're going to want to have charging infrastructure that meets your user need in the situation. So on a motorway service station, I would never deploy any of our charging points because it would take you 3+ hours to charge your car. By contrast, I wouldn't be deploying rapids and ultra rapids on residential streets where your car sits for long periods of time, and similarly in workplaces. So I think there are lots of solutions out there. We've had, as a business, we hope we've come to COP and made some exciting announcements. So for context, the UK market has about 24,000 public charging points. We announced on Monday that we've contracted over 10,000 charging points in the last 3 months, all public charging points to be deployed. I think the unique part, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, the unique part about what we announced on Monday is for the first time we're able to bring private finance to fund alongside public capital or even on its own. And the reason for that is that those 10,000 charging points, one, the scale is completely different. So pre-pandemic, I think there's been huge progress because pre-pandemic, you were sort of looking at 30 to 40 charging points with a local authority. In some of those deals now, it's multiple thousands of charging points. But the critical difference, as well as the scale, is the duration of the contracts. So when you're trying to bring finance to this, if you have a contract for 5 to 10 years, you've got a huge risk piece in that. Not around whether EV is going to happen, but really when EV is going to happen and at what scale. So the long-term contracts means that you can manage that. So the contracts we announced on Monday are range between 15 and 25 years, which means I can bring the long-term finances, the infrastructure finances to this, because this has moved from a product sale to an infrastructure proposition. And that's really what I think needed to happen in the UK and will need to happen elsewhere.
So that's fantastic, and congratulations on your announcement. The 15 to 25-year infrastructure financing, is that all being done through private finance, institutional investment, or does it need some kind of public subsidy or guarantee, or if you wouldn't mind?
I think you're teeing up the fantastic report that was released earlier this week by your team. So there were some great ideas in that, and I think there's some wonderful ideas in that. I think there's probably a blend. So I think it depends. There are some locations which make complete sense from a commercial perspective already today, and there are therefore probably no need for public finance in those instances. There are equally others where, for some time, it may need to have some public-private sort of partnership together. I think the beauty, though, of large-scale and long-term contracts means that you can start to treat assets as a portfolio. So you can blend lower-performing assets with really high-performing assets, and you can also start to challenge some of the initial hypotheses in the EV market, which is, for example, you may want to go and deploy a charging point in an extremely wealthy area. That makes a lot of sense if you have a short-term contract because you're likely to see quick adoption in that area. But often in very, very wealthy areas, particularly during the pandemic, people are able to work from home. They tend to live next to very good transport links, so they don't commute such long distances. Whereas if you have a long-term contract, you can therefore afford to go into some of the poorer areas where people, the nature of where they live, may have to commute longer distances, are unable to work from home because of the types of jobs that they do. So I think when we look forward, those long-term contracts allow you to overcome a lot of the inequalities in EV charging infrastructure.
And it's such a key point that you've made there, Chris. I think it is unconscionable, this idea that wealthy neighbourhoods are going to have cleaner air, quieter streets, and we're consigning poorer, less privileged neighbourhoods to continuing to have polluting diesel and ICE cars, and we do need to find a solution to that. And you did allude to our Road to Zero publication that came out yesterday. 200 experts contributed to that work, and the research has identified a £150 billion funding opportunity for private investment into the EV market. But it's key that we find a way of unlocking that and unlocking it equitably.
I agree completely. And unfortunately, there's a lot of talk around I know it's become an overly politicised phrase, but the levelling up sort of concept. And if we don't get this right, this risks just sort of reinforcing some of the existing challenges in society. So those wealthier areas are already the ones which have the best air quality. It's the poorer areas which are already the ones which have the worst air quality. So solving it is important. And again, on Monday, I think the announcement, the best thing about it was we think we found a solution in terms of that sort of financing the private side.
Fantastic. And am I right in saying of those 24,000 public chargers, almost half of them are in the southeast of England and London?
I think 60% of all charging points are within the M25. So, that's partly because the London governance system has done such a great job of deploying. So it's not necessarily a negative, and I think there's now some great blueprints that can be sort of followed. Most of that was not deployed through, well, in fact, very little of it was deployed through private capital. It was mainly government grants. So I think now...
A significant number of those are also the other on-street parking, yes. Right? So that for people that are able to charge up through lampposts and things like that, there's a number of different options that have popped up across some leading London boroughs that have really led the charge. Excuse the pun. But actually, we also released another report yesterday with National Grid that said you're also not more than 25 miles from a rapid charger. So for those longer journeys, and you know there are other options. And I completely agree. Interestingly, there's many fewer drivers in London that don't have a driveway. So, sorry, many more drivers that don't have a driveway.
Yep.
So actually, they do need to have more of the curbside type charging. Yep. In cities and...
Well, and here in Glasgow, it's 89%, I think, have to rely on public, as in they have to park in on streets. So
and much higher, yeah.
Certain
so
urban
cities
areas really high.
Yeah. But, I mean, absolutely, picking up on the same report, when we look at the financing of vehicles as well, and back to your point on the leasing side, actually, leasing is a great way of overcoming that total cost of ownership challenge that we were talking about earlier and financing it. And actually, the same report, led by the GFI, in fact, that came out, looked at ways in which we might be able to encourage more leasing, look at securitization of EV loans, or even 0% finance for vehicles, which also comes with other benefits as well, because where they might have concerns around, is this going to work for them? Can I try it before I buy it? And we're seeing new financing models come out in ways of things like subscription models, a bit like the Spotify for leasing, where then even you might be able to roll in some of that charging. But again, if we can help encourage finance into that space so that we can finance those vehicles, get them out there, people try them out. And I'd like to pick up on your point, which people are just buying it for ecological reasons. These are great cars.
No, I know.
These are really fun. Back to you.
But
Will,
people don't know.
Yes. I think, yeah, I mean, let's get him on here and see if he's buying it just for ecological reasons.
People don't know, do they? They don't know how wonderful cars they are.
We should get them in, so let's finance a few more of them. We'll get Will out there, test driving a few people out, the neighbours. But actually, EV ambassadors are doing a huge amount to get people into their vehicles and get them out for test drives. So we're seeing actually this kind of community of EV drivers. If there's one on your street, you should go down and ask them for a drive, because they are so fun. They're fun, they are affordable, and they are also good for the planet. So those are 3 reasons we find that people are...
Anyone who has an EV knows that while you're sat there charging your car, you're sat there doing something, and you'll get a knock on the window. And you always are getting asked by people what's going on with this.
People are curious.
Like a cool
Over 70%, I think, of the UK are considering electric for their next vehicle now, which is a huge shift. And it's kind of, how do we make it easy? How do we make it affordable? And also, how do we make sure there's enough supply? Because really, the big challenge we have is the supply of vehicles. There aren't enough of them. And I think, to Hiro's points around the chip shortage is definitely causing an issue. And that's across the whole of the market in terms of automakers. But there is that incentive piece. And I wonder if there is more that we could do to encourage some of those, older manufacturers, to encourage them to make that switch more quickly. And I think that might be through investment. And how do we choose who to support? Are they making the right decisions? And we saw yesterday a number of companies came out and made commitments alongside countries to phase out petrol and diesel cars by 2040 globally, which, let's debate whether or not that's even close to being the right number, the right date. But the fact that some of the car manufacturers weren't there, they weren't listed. And so how do we encourage those to get on board and really commit to phasing out petrol and diesel cars? And so actually having a slightly higher price point for some of the cars on the list price might be okay if that enables them to go quicker. But I could still sell them. I've got a really long waiting list of people that want these cars. And actually, if we can then finance them in different ways, for example, some of the recommendations in the GFI report, that still enables them to be more affordable than their petrol diesel counterparts because of the financing and because of the running costs and total cost of ownership.
What I love about this conversation is, we've said it a few times on this platform over the last week or so, this is such an exciting time to be a financier. These are real world problems that require the ingenuity and creativity of financial professionals to help figure out how we make this happen. And your enthusiasm for it is fantastic, Fiona. By the way, Will does not need any encouragement to evangelize about his Tesla. That's already happening. In fact, it's a step away from being on the payroll, I think. Over to you, Uday, around a lot of the work that you've been doing, bringing these stakeholders together. I mean, you represent an enormous pool of capital for institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds. And I mean, we've touched on it as well, which is, it isn't just about the manufacturers or the consumers. There's also a whole supply chain. There's batteries. There's a whole raft of investment opportunities here. So it'd be great to hear from your experience so far of trying to drive this.
So if we think about the carbon challenge of the next 10 years, we could rely on the usual S-curve, and it will be late. So the question is, how do we force the S-curve? And forcing the S-curve for very large-scale institutional investors brings its own perspective. Because when these investors look at the world, they're looking for very large-scale addressable opportunities to move that S-curve. And so we've looked carefully at many different categories of transportation and have come to the view that municipal buses, for example, are a very easily addressable segment. Partially, it's already happening. You've all been traveling around Glasgow on electric buses. But also because some of those asset themes are not that different to the great revolution that occurred in renewable energy. And your counterparty very often is a government or a credit-worthy entity. And the contract structure allows you to be able to provide a mobility as a service model. I mentioned in my earlier response some of that ecosystem you have to bring together. But when you can aggregate pools of institutional capital, and my experience of this has been in various avatars over the last 15 years, you have the credibility to sit down with all the stakeholders in a single room and say, all right, how do we take this from 5,000 buses to 15,000 buses? What would it take for you, Mr. Manufacturer OEM? What would it take for you, city and incentives at the city level? What would it take for you, government? And that credibility of being able to speak for capital unlocks the minds of many of these OEMs, operators, and governments in ways that, if you left it only to the traditional capital market, may not happen. So we really believe deeply in this trilateral process of bringing together industry, government, and finance on large-scale solutions. Now, whereas that's the case in the what we might call the large asset market of buses and infrastructure that might go with that, in the case of micromobility or cars, you do need to work with leasing institutions and others, wherein they can be your partner in going from large-scale institutional capital to the consumer. And that's a slightly different world. But the point I was making earlier and I'm making now is that through these processes, and we're exploring ideas all over in various different hats I wear in the US, in Europe, in Asia, because we mustn't forget the emerging countries as well. We were talking about, making sure this is an equitable and just transition. And of course, some of the largest markets in the world, as we've seen in China, are coming out of emerging countries. My country, India, Africa has its own needs. Latin America is a huge market. So these collaborative conversations unlock, if you like, models. And what's fascinating is that those models can be replicated in other parts of the world. So as they gain credibility, you can then blueprint that, just as happened with power purchase agreements in renewables. You can take that same system to other parts of the world. Finally, there is another opportunity, which is more difficult, but I don't want to give up on it. I think it's very important. And in this COP, we haven't achieved $100 billion a year in the North-South dialogue. And I believe that by thinking creatively about aggregating large pools of capital like this, using risk mitigation not only at the city level or at the national level, but even in international contexts, you can work with northern governments and southern governments and industry to create structures, I hope, that could vastly accelerate the speed and credibility of the international process.
And let's hope that the COP26 really has fired the starting gun on more of those types of conversation of public finance being used as risk capital and this idea of how we share replicable blueprints. I love the points you were making, Chris, about let's celebrate the success that we have so many charging points in the southeast, because we may have cracked the code on how to do it in certain neighborhoods using certain data. With that, I'm conscious of time. I'm conscious that it's coming to the end of COP. So I was hoping to get all your reflections on the last couple of weeks and what it is you'll be taking forward from having spent some time here in Glasgow. Hiro, if I may start with you, your overriding impression of COP and what's going to be different going forward?
Sure, I think I share a lot of excitement about the several governments made the surprisingly ambitious NDCs, and G funds and all those send a strong message that the business are very conscious about the achieving net zero. But the point is, we need to make sure we'll go back and do our homework. Otherwise, we ended up having a big a greenwashing event at the COP26. So that's one thing. And the other thing is as the other panelists talked about, the one thing I saw and I was very encouraged was up to the last COP26, I always felt that developing country was the saying oh, it's not our fault. So the developed countries, you have to be responsible, and we need to grow our economy. And we have to use the older technology, which knowing it's not very clean. But this time I heard a totally different message, because the people are saying, developing countries saying, hey, don't sell us the brown technology. Don't sell us ICE vehicle anymore. We want to go for electric. Don't sell us coal-fired power. Sell us the clean renewable energy. So and we need the financing for that. So I was really encouraged that change in their attitude, and I really think a developed country has a real responsibility to respond to that.
Thank you so much. And same question to you, Chris.
So I'll be completely honest, COP's quite difficult to keep up with everything that's going on.
Yes.
So I'm quite looking forward to my train journeys back to London this evening to try and catch up on everything that's been agreed. I think from our side, we're really excited about what business is committed to. And I'm also quite excited by the amount of energy and enthusiasm that there is here. I'd caveat, though, and say that it's quite easy to be in a bit of a bubble here, because the local community is completely involved in COP, and you walk in here and you're made to feel very clearly that they're expecting everyone to have made progress from this. The thing I always reflect on, though, is that not everyone in society necessarily will believe what's been agreed here and will be expecting people to deliver. So when we go and deploy our charging points, for example, a big focus of what we do is to try and go and engage the local population and go and engage the community. And I think one of the learnings, actually, for me coming and working with the founders to set up Connected Curb is that an awful lot of it has to be how you engage the community, and you spend a lot of your time educating. You think you've got a great proposition, but it takes a while for everyone to get on board. So I'll be going away and we'll be redoubling our efforts on that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's an optimistic COP. Everyone's word, I think, of the 2 weeks now is optimistic. We'll see what comes out, though. I know there's a lot of tough negotiations still going on. But as well as being a finance COP, it's absolutely a business COP. And getting business here and so much commitment, I think, is really powering, accelerating that change. But I think there is the outside world. We are here, we've had an excellent couple of weeks, but you can see the marches at the weekend, there are people that are angry, there's things like eco-anxiety, there's a lot of health challenges off the back of it. So actually it's more broadly what we all take away and what we're all doing in our home communities and the society we live in.
Thank you. And we are technically out of time, but I would love to hear just a very final short word from you, Uday.
Big difference between Rio 92 and now is that business and finance are all over this. And I completely agree on that. I would say it's very optimistic for the year 2040, 2050 for a very clean planet. But for 2030 carbon and the natural science that you mentioned, we really have to now scale this thing up at a very different rate. I would say I'm also optimistic about some of the yesterday's announcement between the US and China. I think that's critical. And as far as my country, India, is concerned, I think that the targets that have been set down for 2030 are very worthy targets. So we just have to get behind this now and accelerate it, because we're on the precipice and there's also golden opportunity or green opportunity.
Well, all that's left for me to do is thank the panelists. Thank you for your messages of optimism today. But as Hero said, the homework starts here, and looking forward to working with you at the GFI to help us decarbonise road transport. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We need a shift in our economic model.
We will get this done.
What is the cause? Survival.
No time to waste.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone to Green Horizon Summit at COP26. I'm Rhian-Mari, CEO of the Green Finance Institute, and speaking live here at the Sir Roger Gifford studio in Glasgow. Over the last few days, it's been my great pleasure to welcome global finance leaders and influencers to this platform. And as we come to the end of our programme, I'm pleased to welcome back Mark Carney for his final reflections on the events of these past 2 weeks. Mark.
Hello, it's Mark Carney. It's remarkable that we have come to this day. So much has been packed in since the first Green Horizon Summit a little less than 12 months ago. It was a remarkable event. I want to give full testimony to the Lord Mayor, to Rhian-Mari, to the team for an absolutely extraordinary support and leadership over the course of the UK's COP presidency. It truly has been transformational. I think it has shown the city in its best light, and it has shown the future to the city and to the world. And I think in many respects has given us hope that we can meet this enormous challenge. It's very difficult to sum up what's happened, but let me try very quickly. The first is to note that 12 months ago in the Mansion House, we set out a strategy for the Private Finance Hub. It had 24 deliverables. As you know, 3 R's and an M, you've heard it ad nauseum, and very much focused on changing the plumbing in the financial market so that every decision would take climate change into account. We were very proud to stand up on November 3rd last week and put checks next to all 24 of those deliverables. Issues is related to climate-related financial disclosure and the pathway to mandatory. Absolutely extraordinary to be there and have 40 countries backing the new International Sustainability Standards Board, those countries representing over 70% of global emissions. I think we're all aware the SEC on a parallel track with their consultation on TCFD-based emissions. So the prospect of having mandatory climate-related financial disclosure is in sight. It's true leadership, and of course the United Kingdom has already taken the lead with the Chancellor's announcement at the first Green Horizon Summit. Secondly, remarkable on risk as well to reach 100 central banks and supervisors as part of the NGFS, embedding stress testing of banks and insurers, climate-related stress testing, covering, again, about more than 2/3 of global emissions. So this is at the heart. And of course, all globally systemic banks are part of the NGFS supervisory group. So these learnings on how to manage these risks at the heart. As well, focusing in as is the nature of the city and the nature of the City of London Corporation on opportunity, on solving problems, not just managing risks. We were very pleased to have the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero grow to its latest level, over $130 trillion, as you're aware. But very importantly, an action-oriented alliance. An alliance is focused on near-term results, 5-year decarbonization plans, fair share of that 50% down by 2030, tackling tough issues about how to deal with stranded assets, how to have best practice net zero transition plans for companies, for financial institutions, how to develop a scaled market for capital flows to the emerging and developing world, encircling over $1 trillion of additional capital per annum for those countries as part of a proposed new country platform approach. I have every confidence because of the talent in the city, because of the dedication of the City of London Corporation, that we can move all of this forward. We will be judged by our actions, by the emissions reductions, by the quality of the transition, just transition, and also, and something that has come very clearly through the work together, including in Glasgow, has been the importance of being nature positive alongside the transition to net zero. A big topic, a topic that has to be urgently addressed, but one that I know the city can help us address. So look, with that, I've run out of time as usual. I want to thank again the Lord Mayor, William Russell, for his personal leadership, the City of London Corporation, Rhian-Mari for your leadership, your intellectual leadership and drive, and everyone who's made this past year a success, because it had to be a success. And of course, we have to build on that platform going forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark, from all of us here, not only for generously sharing your insights and supporting the Green Horizon Summit, but for raising net zero ambitions across the financial system and bringing the world's financial leaders here to Glasgow in a way we've never previously seen at COP. It's been both a challenging and rewarding 2 weeks here in Glasgow, but standing here today, there is definitely reason to be optimistic. Only last night, China and the US, the world's two biggest carbon emitters, unveiled a joint declaration to work together to cut emissions over the next decade. With so much at stake, the significance of this moment cannot be underestimated. We must now draw inspiration from this example of radical collaboration, because it is the only way to get this job done. As the negotiators enter the final hours of their discussions, attempting to keep the fight for 1.5 degrees alive, we have arrived at a point of critical inflection. Never before have we seen and heard so much enthusiasm and commitment to the transition to net zero from across the financial sector, much of it from within this very room. The work of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with its 450 signatories that collectively control $130 trillion of total assets, has brought the financial community to the table like never before. And yes, we will need detailed transition plans, innovative financial mechanisms, and robust regulation to ensure promises are kept and commitments are converted into capital. But at COP26, private finance has laid down the gauntlet to policymakers and public sector financiers, and we all need to step up if we are to seize the opportunity to finance the transformation of the global economy in line with the science. We need to build trust between the public and private sectors, foster the collaborative willpower needed to take this agenda forward, and ensure that all actors and voices are brought to the decision-making table, including those of local communities and Indigenous people, who have long been the stewards of our most precious resources. As we come to the end of the Green Horizon Summit at COP26, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of our partners, speakers, and participants who have joined us. And of course, to the team here on the ground making all of this possible. We must now continue to use this momentum and our platform, not only to foster conversation and call for action, but to deliver action ourselves. And that is our commitment at the Green Horizon Summit, at the City of London Corporation, and at the Green Finance Institute. Because if COP26 is to go down in the history books as a success, it must mark the inflection point when the challenge of halving emissions by 2030 and of reaching net zero by 2050 became our collective goal. It has to be the moment when we realise that this isn't an issue for others to solve. It is a challenge where every single one of us can use our personal platform, our expertise, and our energy to support the transition to a net zero, nature positive, and inclusive world. I've always said that the financial sector is full of creative problem solvers. Well, this is the greatest problem of our generation, and we all have an opportunity, a responsibility, to act. We really hope you've enjoyed the Green Horizons Summit, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. But more than anything, we hope that we've played our small part in bringing together inspiring speakers, creative thinkers, not only in our studio, but most importantly, amongst you, our audience. So together, we really can do this. Thank you.